What would you do if one day the very system you believed in turned you into a suspect simply because of the color of your skin? Jasmine Fields, a lawyer, a symbol of justice in Baltimore, was handcuffed in the courthouse parking lot. Her crime? She was unlocking her own car. No one asked her name. No one asked her why. They just looked at her and saw a threat. But Jasmine didn't stay silent. She turned the bruise on her wrist into a powerful testimony, turned pain into the beginning of a movement. And her story will hold you spellbound, because sometimes justice needs someone brave enough to say, enough. What do you do when the very law you serve turns against you simply because of the color of your skin? Baltimore, on a sweltering September afternoon, was a city where cracked sidewalks mirrored the old lies no longer able to stay hidden. In the heart of a place where history clashed with contradiction, Judge Jasmine Fields stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse, her eyes quietly following the line of people filing out. Jasmine, 43 years old, the first black woman to hold a senior criminal court judgeship in Baltimore ways, once a prosecutor, once a victim, and now a symbol. But as she often said, symbols meant nothing if they couldn't reshape reality. That day, she was simply heading to her usual parking spot in the restricted judicial lot. In her hands was a thick case file, another incident of mistaken identity, a young man arrested because of a name match. One more injustice in a long line she had witnessed, and this time she was determined not to let it vanish quietly. She had just bent to open her trunk when the sound of rushing footsteps echoed behind her. Before she could turn around, a harsh voice yelled, "Back up! Drop the bag! Hands on your head!" 3 voices. 3 guns aimed directly at her 3 plainclothes officers, who didn't realize the woman opening that car was the presiding judge of one of the very courts they had sworn to uphold. Jasmine stood still, hands still gripping the folder. "I am Judge Fields," she said, calm but firm. Her voice didn't de-escalate the situation. One of the men, white, tall, imposing, stepped forward and ripped the file from her hands, scattering papers across the pavement. "We don't care who you are. Stand there and shut up," he snapped. People began to gather. Some pulled out phones. A middle-aged woman shouted, "That's Judge Fields. Are you out of your minds?" Still, it didn't stop. When Jasmine stepped slightly toward the trunk, trying to prove her identity, one officer grabbed her, spun her around, and slammed her face against the car. The sound of her cheek hitting metal rang out across the hot afternoon. Blood welled up from her skin just as her eyes locked onto the lens of a phone camera filming everything. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg, but her eye sweat, fierce and deeply restrained, said more than any accusation ever could. Quiet, wounded, unflinching. When another officer rushed over to confirm her identity and realized the mistake, the air shifted from tension to horror. One man stammered, "We're sorry. We're so sorry, Judge Fields." But apologies meant nothing to a woman who had spent her life upholding justice in a system that repeatedly denied it to people like her. As the officers stepped back, Jasmine's gaze cut through them not out of fear, but because she saw something far more dangerous. A system where 3 armed men felt entitled to treat a black woman opening her own trunk like a threat. What if she hadn't been a judge? No witnesses? No camera? No bystander shouting her name? That night, in her old wooden house in Bolton Hill, she sat by the window, the red mark still fresh on her cheek. A cup of tea sat untouched. Next to it, a letter from the police department labeled, "Unfortunate Incident." She didn't need to read it. She already knew. It wasn't an incident. It was a conditioned reflex, a mirror of bias, and a deafening alarm. Jasmine Fields was not the kind of woman to stay silent. She opened her drawer, pulled out her voice recorder, switched it on, and began documenting every detail. Not to file a complaint for herself, but to begin writing a new chapter in the fight against injustice. It wasn't the first time Jasmine Fields had felt the sting of suspicion while standing next to her own car. But never before had that suspicion felt so cold, so thick, and so unmistakably clear as it did that fateful morning in the downtown Baltimore parking lot. She had just finished a grueling 3-hour hearing at the Maryland Court of Appeals, where she was defending the rights of a black mother who had been unfairly stripped of custody by the child welfare system. A light drizzle clung to the city, and Jasmine's neatly tied curls had frizzed in the damp air. She opened the trunk of her car to retrieve a brown file folder. Another case in the long chain of injustices she had witnessed, and this time, she was determined not to let it be forgotten. Just as she leaned into the trunk, the sudden blare of a police siren behind her sliced through the city noise like a gunshot. "What are you doing here?" barked a rigid voice from behind the rolled-down window of a patrol car. Jasmine startled but held her composure and instinct honed through more than 15 years of legal arguments and courtroom tension. "I'm the owner of this vehicle," she replied calmly, gesturing toward the license plate and the key fob still in her hand. "I just left court. My office is 2 blocks away." 2 officers, both white, middle-aged men, stepped out of the cruiser. One approached while the other kept a hand near his holstered gun. Jasmine had seen this look before. The guarded stance, the wary tone, the way they studied her, as though she were a threat just for being there. "We got a call about someone trying to break into cars around here," the first officer said, his eyes scanning her from head to toe like she was a suspect, not a judge. She didn't react right away. She knew better. React too quickly, and you're labeled aggressive. Too slowly, and you're suspicious. In Jasmine's world, her very existence had to be proven through her attorney badge, her registered vehicle, her composed voice. "You're welcome to check the license plate, the registration inside, or even call the court I just came from." Her tone stayed even, never submissive, never defiant. She had mastered the balance, living in a society constantly poised to knock her from the place she'd fought hard to reach. But what happened next didn't fit even the worst-case scenarios Jasmine had braced herself for. As she leaned into the front seat to retrieve her wallet with her ID and bar card, the second officer shouted, "Hands up, don't reach for anything." Before she could look up, a forceful shove slammed her head into the car door. She was thrown to the wet pavement face down in the mud of the parking lot as her arms were yanked backward. "What are you doing?" Jasmine cried out in pain and disbelief. "I'm a lawyer. I was getting my wallet. You have no reason to." "Shut up," one of the officers barked, tightening the handcuffs on her wrists. That's when a witness appeared, a white woman, older, emerging from the nearby bookstore. "Let her go," she shouted. "I know her. She's a lawyer. She defended my niece in court." But truth took 10 more minutes, 3 phone calls, and a supervising officer before it was finally acknowledged, and by then, Jasmine was already in the back of the police car, her cheek scraped, wrists bleeding beneath the metal cuffs. When the last cuff was finally undone, and the reluctant apology, "It was a misunderstanding," was mumbled, Jasmine said nothing. She rose quietly, brushed the filth from her ash-gray coat, and locked eyes with the 2 men who had, in the name of law, done something lawless. Her gaze was no longer that of a victim. It was the quiet, searing stare of someone who would remember every face involved in this misuse of power. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't lash out. But when she picked up the file folder still lying abandoned in a rain puddle, her hand trembled. Not from fear, but from rage, compressed and buried deep, from the invisible injury of a woman who had spent her life believing in the justice system, only to be humiliated by it in broad daylight. That day, Jasmine didn't return to her office. She drove straight to the small apartment on the west side of the city, the place where she and her sister had grown up, where her aging mother still sat by the window knitting every afternoon. "Mom," Jasmine said as she entered, her voice catching in her throat, "today I almost forgot who I am." Her mother didn't ask what happened. She simply rose and held her daughter close, like in those distant schoolyard days when little Jasmine had to learn silence just to be accepted. "Remember who you are," her mother whispered. "You are Jasmine Fields. And don't ever let anyone make you forget that, especially when they try their hardest to." That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. Her small apartment, normally a place of calm, after intense court sessions, now felt unfamiliar. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking clock on the wall, cars passing outside, even the thudding of her own heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself being slammed against the car hood, her arms twisted painfully behind her back, a knee digging into her spine, and the stares of bystanders, some concerned, others indifferent. Those moments played in slow motion, but the humiliation clung to her skin like it had just happened. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at a city that was still asleep. Baltimore hadn't changed, still chaotic and calm, quietly burning. She wondered, how many other black people had been treated like this, and no one ever found out? How many times had the truth been swallowed by the phrase, a misunderstanding? How many times had silence nourished institutional contempt? In the soft glow of her bedside lamp, Jasmine glanced at a weathered picture frame on the shelf, a photo of her and her father, Reverend Bernard Fields, back when he was still alive. In the picture, he was smiling wide in a gray suit, arm wrapped proudly around his daughter, who had just been accepted into law school. Next to it lay a leather-bound notebook where he had written speeches from the civil rights era. Jasmine opened the book. On the first page was a quote he repeated often in his sermons. "Silence is complicity. You don't have to shout, but you must speak, because if you don't, someone will believe you agree." She froze. It felt like something inside her had just awakened. Her father, the man who had marched beside Dr. King, been arrested for protesting segregation, and preached in churches, knowing full well the FBI was watching, he had not been silent. And now, it was her turn. Jasmine walked into her home office, turned on her computer, and opened a voice recorder. She began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but after a few minutes, she recounted everything clearly. The moment she left the courthouse, walking to her car, seeing the two officers, the terror of being forced down onto her own vehicle, her words being ignored, and the pain of being treated like a thief behind the wheel of her own car. She saved the recording. The file name, "I am Jasmine Fields." At sunrise, she wrote a formal complaint to the Baltimore Police Department and reached out to an old friend who worked for the Baltimore Sunday. Not for revenge, but to document the truth, fully, honestly, and unfiltered. "Jas, are you sure about this?" her friend asked over the phone. "You already know who I am," Jasmine replied, her voice solid as steel. "I'm a lawyer, and the law was never meant to bow to a uniform." Before she hit send, she reviewed the complaint one last time. There wasn't a single word of anger. Just evidence, timestamps, details, testimony, and a clear call for action. Jasmine understood that to change anything, you had to start by defining the truth through reason, not rage. When the email was finally sent, the clock struck 6 a.m. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the first rays of light had begun to cut through the window pane. She stood tall, gently rubbing her still bruised wrists. The bruises hadn't healed, but they marked the beginning of something greater. The next morning, Jasmine Fields' name appeared in bold on the front page of the Baltimore Sunday, beneath a headline that sent shockwaves through the city. "Attorney mistakenly arrested while unlocking her own car." The accompanying photo showed Jasmine, still in her business attire, handcuffed and bowed, standing in the parking lot behind the very courthouse where she worked each day. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. The Washington Post, NBC News, CNN, and other major news outlets picked up the report, sparking a flurry of commentary. On social media, grainy videos began to circulate. One clip captured from afar showed Jasmine being slammed to the ground. Her arms forced behind her back as she screamed, "This is my car. I'm Jasmine Fields." Her voice cut through the chaos, and to many, it echoed the cries of thousands whose mistreatment had gone unheard for too long. The Baltimore Police Department was quick to respond. They held an urgent press conference where the spokesperson called it an unfortunate misunderstanding in the course of proactive crime prevention. The two officers involved, they claimed, were following procedure and did not recognize Jasmine's identity at the time. "We evaluate based on behavior, not on social standing or reputation," the police chief stated, his voice tense. But rather than calming the public, that defense only deepened the divide. On Twitter, the hashtag number Justice for Jasmine shot into the trending list within a single afternoon. Thousands of voice law students, everyday citizens, attorneys, and activists rallied in support. One user posted, "If someone like Jasmine Fields, an acclaimed lawyer, can be treated like a car thief, what hope is there for the rest of us?" A TikTok video went viral, garnering millions of views. In it, a young black law student tearfully said, "I studied to become the next Jasmine Fields. She was our role model. Now, she's the one being thrown down for simply walking to her car." Conversely, far-right outlets like Blue Line Tribune and Protect Our Cops defended the officers. They emphasized public safety concerns, citing cases where attackers had disguised themselves as harmless civilians. "No one can be sure of someone's identity in a potentially dangerous situation," one article read. These officers were doing their job. The division of public opinion pushed Jasmine straight into the center of a national storm, but this time she refused to stay silent. In a live video broadcast, Jasmine appeared before the camera, eyes fierce, though weary. "I don't need you to know I'm a lawyer. I need you to believe that a black woman has the right to unlock her own car without being seen as a threat. If my dignity is reduced to the color of my skin, then we have failed the very promise of justice our Constitution was built on." Her words were quoted far and wide. Evening talk shows began hosting discussions on implicit bias in law enforcement. Scholars, journalists, and advocates brought forth examples showing Jasmine's case was not an outlier, it was a mirror. A quick poll from the Baltimore Times revealed 68% believed Jasmine was racially profiled, but 32% stood by the officers, stating their suspicion was reasonable under the circumstances. Still, what moved Jasmine the most wasn't the numbers. It was the letters and messages she received from a single black mother in New Jersey, an immigrant father from Haiti, and a recent college graduate. All wrote the same thing: "Your story is our story." For Jasmine, division wasn't something to fear. In fact, it was proof that her voice mattered. "When an entire nation stays silent in the face of injustice," she said, "sometimes one voice is all it takes to shake it awake." She was no longer just the woman who had been wrongfully detained. She was now the one asking the bigger question: is justice truly for everyone? Jasmine Fields was no longer the woman wrongly handcuffed on the cold pavement of a parking lot. She had risen not with rage, but with intellect, determination, and an unwavering faith in the law. And this time, she chose to fight in a way the system couldn't easily ignore, through the law itself. Just days after the incident, Jasmine filed a formal petition with the Baltimore City Council, calling for a public hearing on the city's police protocols regarding identity verification and arrests. In her filing, she cited provisions from Maryland state law, emphasizing the right of all citizens to be treated fairly and not to be suspected solely based on appearance or bias. She didn't ask for an apology, she demanded an explanation and reform. The hearing was quickly approved, driven by public and media pressure. The City Hall chamber, typically the scene of long, uneventful meetings, was packed to the walls. Local and national media filled the room, while hundreds of residents lined the streets outside holding signs that read, "My name is not suspect," and "Justice doesn't see color." Jasmine stepped up to the podium not in a judge's robe or formal courtroom attire. Just a crisp white shirt, neatly pinned curls, and eyes full of resolve. Her voice was steady and clear, not shaking, not asking for sympathy. That day, I wasn't a lawyer. I was a woman opening her own car, and if that act alone is considered suspicious, how many others are being questioned simply because they don't fit someone's idea of safe? She presented evidence, beginning with surveillance footage from the building across the street submitted to the record with an official timestamp. The video clearly showed Jasmine unlocking her own car and searching for documents. No sudden movements, no threats. Yet two officers approached, exchanged a few words, and then forced her onto the hood, handcuffing her in broad daylight. When the video ended, the room was dead silent. This wasn't emotion, this was data, truth. And truth doesn't lie. Jasmine followed with statistics. In the past 5 years, Baltimore had recorded more than 2,000 wrongful detentions. Over 70% involved Black individuals. Many never got to speak. No cameras. No lawyers. She said, "I'm not just standing here for myself. I'm standing for them, those who were never believed simply because of the color of their skin." When the police department representative was invited to respond, he repeated that this was a misunderstanding during an active operation. But the excuse had lost its power. Jasmine asked directly, "If I were a white woman, wearing the same clothes, doing the same thing, would I have been cuffed?" No one answered. The hearing ended with a mix of applause and quiet reflection. Jasmine didn't claim victory. Instead, she submitted a list of reform proposals: clearer identity verification protocols, unconscious bias training for officers, and most importantly, a public commitment to transparency in wrongful detention data. News channels replayed her speech that evening. One short clip went viral online. Justice is not a privilege. It's a constitutional right. And when it's twisted by prejudice, those who understand the law have a duty to set it straight. Jasmine didn't fight back with anger. She used the very tool the system had tried to weaponize against her, the law, to force it to face itself. And from that moment forward, her story was no longer just personal. It became the spark for a greater conversation about trust, about justice, and about real change. When a Black woman dares to stand in the political arena and demand justice, the system doesn't always respond with words, it responds with shadows. Jasmine Fields had lit a torch in the storm of injustice, but as her light spread, she began to feel the cost of it. Loneliness and threats creeping into every corner of her life like fog. 2 days after the explosive hearing, as Jasmine left her office near 9 p.m., she found a gray envelope placed right at her doorstep. No sender name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed in bold, "Be smart, Fields. You won't even have time to dial 911. She wasn't shocked, but a chill still ran down her spine. She called the police immediately and, ironically, reported the threat to the same department that had once humiliated her. They filed the report mechanically, then sent her back home in silence, without even offering reassurance. The next morning, a former colleague, someone who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine in Baltimore's toughest trials, texted her, "Jas, I have to pull out. My family doesn't want to get involved. I'm sorry." Short, but heavy. Jasmine didn't blame them. Not everyone is willing to stand in the spotlight when it starts to burn. At her office, the atmosphere had changed. A few legal assistants avoided her gaze. She heard whispers behind closed doors, not cruel, but cautious. "She's pushing too hard. They're watching her. She should just step back." A few years ago, words like that might have shaken her, but now, they only solidified her resolve. That evening, Jasmine went home to her mother's house, a small place in West Baltimore where she had grown up. In the cozy, Mrs. Fields, 76 years old with kind but steel-hardened eyes, was making tea. When Jasmine told her everything, her mother's hand paused for a moment, then stirred the cup again as if fear had no place there. "You know, Jasmine," her mother said softly, still watching the kettle, "when I was your age, I got death threats for helping an immigrant family who'd been expelled from school. I didn't stop. Because if I had, who would have helped them? Now it's your turn not to stop." Those words lit a fire in her chest. Jasmine hugged her mother tightly, feeling deeply that even though many doors were slamming shut, one place would always stay open: her mother's embrace. The next day, Jasmine reached out to civil rights organizations, ACLU, Equal Justice Initiative, NAACP, Legal Defense Fund. She proposed expanding her efforts through a public webinar on your legal rights when stopped by police. She also began blogging, detailing the case not to attack, but to educate. Each post garnered tens of thousands of shares, especially among young Black readers hungry for a voice they could trust. A group of law students from Howard University emailed to interview her for a thesis project on racial disparities in law enforcement. She agreed immediately. During the Zoom call, one young woman asked with teary eyes, "Do you ever feel scared?" Jasmine smiled gently and answered, "Yes, every day. But fear doesn't stop me from speaking. It reminds me I'm saying something that matters." She knew if she were only fighting for herself, she might have stepped back. But Jasmine was no longer just a person. She was becoming a symbol of movement waking up, a generation refusing to accept prejudice as destiny. A week later, Jasmine organized a community forum at the city's public library. Despite pouring rain, over 200 people came. Some stood in the hallways, others sat cross-legged on the floor. In the warm glow of the old auditorium, Jasmine stood before the mic and began, "I'm not special. I'm just someone lucky enough to have a voice, and I choose to use it not to retell a painful story, but to begin a new chapter where no one gets judged for simply walking to their own car." Applause thundered. But to Jasmine, the sound wasn't a celebration. It was a vow that she would keep going, no matter how many shadows trailed behind her. And in that room, surrounded by strangers, Jasmine Fields was no longer alone. After days walking the line between light and shadow, between justice and threats, Jasmine Fields was no longer just a victim reclaiming her dignity. She had become a flame. And that flame, instead of smoldering in silence, had ignited a real movement. Just 1 week after her speech went viral on national television, Jasmine officially partnered with the ACLU America's leading civil liberties organization and 2 racial justice advocacy groups to launch a campaign called "My Name Is Not a Suspect." The slogan wasn't just a response to her. "Wrongful arrested" was a message for the millions of people of color who are questioned, doubted, and treated like criminals simply for existing. The campaign began with a public petition on change.org. Within 24 hours, over 50,000 signatures had poured in. By the third day, it reached 120,000. And by the end of the first week, more than 200,000 people had signed, including lawyers, teachers, students, doctors, celebrities, and everyday citizens who had never had any run-ins with the law. A new voice had risen not solo, but in chorus. On the campaign's website, Jasmine shared an essay titled, "When the Law Hurts, We Have the Right to Fix It." In it, she broke down the systemic failures in police, training from the lack of unconscious bias education to the absence of independent oversight for officers with histories of violence. Jasmine appeared on national talk shows, The View, Trevor Noah, and Anderson Cooper 360 Degrees. Everywhere she went, she emphasized one point: "I don't speak for anger, I speak for truth." And sometimes, truth needs a microphone to be heard. The campaign didn't stop at signatures. Jasmine filed an official request for the city to release the full disciplinary records of the officers involved in her arrest, including internal memos, prior citizen complaints, and their training histories. In her letter to the city council, she wrote, "Transparency is not a privilege, it is a responsibility." As expected, the pushback came fast. The police union held a press conference, accusing Jasmine's campaign of damaging the image and morale of law enforcement. They called it a coordinated media attack designed to undermine public trust. But this time, Jasmine wasn't the only one speaking back. Over 300 lawyers and law professors across the country signed an open letter to the Baltimore City Council, expressing full support for Jasmine and urging the city to not just listen but act. Jasmine also invited a group of young law students to meet directly with city commissioners. They brought charts, data, and policy models from other states that had successfully implemented transparency reforms. One student said, "Miss Fields didn't just show us injustice, she showed us how to change it." On social media, number "My Name Is Not a Suspect" trended for nearly 2 consecutive weeks. Victims of wrongful arrest began sharing their own stories using the hashtag. A long-silenced community had found its voice, and even they were surprised that one woman, a lawyer, a survivor, had sparked a national conversation about justice. Jasmine kept her regular schedule, still showing up in work attire. but her eyes no longer carried suppressed rage. They now shone with clarity, like the eyes of someone who knew that even if the system hadn't changed yet, the country was finally paying attention. That weekend, at a community discussion at Union Baptist Church, Jasmine stepped up to the wooden pulpit and raised her right hand, the faint bruise on her wrist still visible. "This is the mark of a mistake, but it's also the sign of a beginning. I'm not here to mourn. I'm here to say this. We deserve a system that doesn't make us lower our heads just to walk down the street." Applause erupted. And somewhere in the back rows, eyes welled with tear snot out of pity, but because they knew this woman was speaking for them. And now, they were ready to stand with her. When public pressure reached its peak, and hashtags like #Justice for Jasmine and "My name is not a suspect" were no longer temporary trends, but the symbol of a nationwide awakening, the city of Baltimore could no longer look away. The machinery of government, long accustomed to silence and stagnation, was forced to open its doors because one woman refused to stay quiet. A special hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at Baltimore City Hall. The line stretched from the main gate all the way to the square, under the sweltering East Coast summer sun. Signs reading, "I am not a suspect" and "Justice has no color" fluttered in the hands of everyday citizens, people who had long been ignored, now demanding to be heard. Inside the chamber, Jasmine Fields stepped up to the podium. No longer the woman handcuffed in a parking lot, she now stood as a voice for millions who had been misunderstood, humiliated, and forgotten. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it carried weight. "I didn't come here seeking pity. I came here demanding justice," she began. "Because justice is not a privilege reserved for the few. Justice is a right promised to us all." She presented a reform proposal with 3 major initiatives. Initial response reform, mandating that all police officers wear body cameras during every civilian encounter. Any stop without video footage would be considered a procedural violation. Implicit bias training, requiring all active and incoming officers to undergo regular training on racial bias, behavioral awareness, and emotional regulation while in uniform. Independent Oversight Board, a body completely separate from the police department, consisting of civil rights leaders, legal experts, and scholars. Jasmine was nominated as an honorary advisor. She backed her proposal with data. In Baltimore, over 72% of mistaken identity stops over the past 5 years involved people of color. Jasmine ended her speech with a line that would be quoted across major headlines the next day. "Silence is no longer an option. Every time we fail to respond to injustice, we silently endorse it." The room paused, then erupted in a standing ovation. Council members, often criticized for being out of touch, could no longer deflect. A vote was called on the spot. Result: 11 in favor, 1 abstention. Jasmine's entire reform package was approved. The news spread fast. That afternoon, local and national outlets ran breaking coverage. On social media, her speech reached over 10 million views in 24 hours. Law schools, journalism classes, and civic education programs began using her testimony as a model for advocacy and community leadership. At a press conference immediately after the hearing, the Baltimore police chief, previously under fire for silence, stated, "We are committed to implementing these reforms. We will not allow this to happen again." But Jasmine didn't smile. She knew promises were easy. Real change would take patience, pressure, and persistence. On the way home, she passed streets still lined with protest signs. She knew that what happened today was not the finish line. It was just the beginning. That night, in her small apartment, Jasmine placed the file folder on the table, turned on her recorder, and said, "Day 48. We've made progress, but the road is long, and we're not stopping." She turned the recorder off. Outside her window, the street lamps cast a quiet yellow glow over Baltimore's streets. And somewhere in the shadows, there were still corners untouched by light. But a torch had been lit and Jasmine wouldn't let it go out. After the reforms Jasmine Fields proposed were officially passed, The wave of the movement she had sparked began to stretch far beyond the city limits of Baltimore. Every speech, every interview, and every article featuring her story didn't just gain attention, they became a source of inspiration for millions who had been stifled by bias. Top universities like Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, Columbia, and Howard all extended invitations for Jazz to speak. In lecture halls filled with students, she didn't just recount the wrongful arrest, she focused on a deeper issue, the normalization of silence by those in power. At a roundtable at NYU, Jasmine spoke clearly and with emotion. The most painful part wasn't the handcuffs or the bruises. It was realizing that no matter who you are, how much you've studied, how much you've contributed, your skin color alone can still make you a threat. Her talks quickly became central to student-led movements across the country. At UCLA, after her speech, students founded Justice Speaks, a legal aid collective for students of color. At Spelman College, female students curated an exhibit titled Women Who Rose from Injustice, with the largest photo being Jasmine Fields, her eyes firm, resolute, yet compassionate. Not stopping there, Jasmine launched a nonprofit called Equal Female Legal Support Network for people wrongly arrested, discriminated against, or mistreated by law enforcement. In its first 60 days, Equal Frame received over 11,000 requests from 42 states. Waves of volunteer lawyers, law students, and civil rights consultants began pouring in. A young attorney from Chicago wrote in an email to Jasmine, "I never thought I'd be fighting for something this big. But your story made me realize justice cannot stand still, it must walk with action." Simultaneously, Netflix announced a new documentary titled Her Name Was Jasmine. Directed by Ava DuVernay, famed for 13th and When They See Us, film chronicled Jasmine's entire journey, from her wrongful arrest to the hearings to the moment she walked out of City Hall as a symbol of change. The trailer garnered over 20 million views within 48 hours. Major outlets praised it. A voice in the storm and a journey that refused to back down. Jasmine also released her memoir titled Breaking the Bias, a deeply personal account of emotions never shared before, letters she received, and sleepless nights spent reading messages from strangers, people who saw her as their final hope in a chaotic world. The book quickly topped bestseller lists on Amazon and the New York Times. On The Daily Show, Trevor Noah asked, "Was there ever a moment you wanted to stop?" Jasmine paused, then smiled softly. "Every time I read an email from an 8th grader saying he got dragged out of class because someone thought he had a weapon, I know I can't stop. I'm not walking alone." Global human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch invited Jasmine to speak at international forums. She became the voice for victims of violent policing at the United Nations Conference on Racial Equity. At a TEDx Chicago event, she said, "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted justice. But if becoming a symbol pushes justice forward, I accept that with my whole heart." Student movements across the U.S. began using her story as the centerpiece for their workshops. In high schools, Jasmine was added to civic textbooks as a modern-day example of civil rights advocacy. In a year-end PBS interview, Jasmine was asked, "Aren't you afraid?" She smiled gently. "I'm more afraid of silence. Because silence is the only thing that lets injustice live longer than it ever should." Jasmine Fields' misunderstood and wrongly accused it become the embodiment of truth protected by reason, of resistance powered by compassion. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to slam her fists. She simply stood up and didn't step back. And her story now was no longer about a wrongful arrest. It was the beginning of a new chapter in America's justice narrative. It was a calm Saturday morning. The sun was gentle, and Baltimore seemed to hush its usual noise to listen. Jasmine Fields took her little niece, 8-year-old Amara, to the parking lot behind the city courthouse. The girl skipped happily in a yellow floral dress, looking up at her aunt as if she were a silent hero. "Auntie, is this where they tied your hands?" Amara asked, her voice innocent, yet her eyes held a rare seriousness for a child her age. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She walked slowly to the corner of the lot, the very site where her wrongful arrest had shaken the nation. The gray concrete, the red brick wall of everything looked the same. Yet now they bore the colors of memory, awakening, and rebirth. "Yes," Jasmine said softly. "Right here. I was just opening my own car." And then she paused. Her hand gently rested on Amara's shoulder. "Do you know why I brought you here today?" Amara shook her head. "Because justice doesn't just appear, Amara. It has to be remembered. It has to be retold, so that wrongs aren't buried beneath the words misunderstanding." Jasmine sat down and pulled from her bag a small voice recorder, the very one she used on that fateful night. She played the first recording. Her voice rang out, steady and firm. "My name is Jasmine Fields. I was wrongfully arrested, but I am not a victim. I am a citizen, and I will not be silent." Amara listened, eyes wide, unblinking. "Who did you say all that for?" she asked. Jasmine smiled and brushed her niece's hair aside. "For kids like you. So you grow up in a world where the law protects you, not scares you." As the sun rose higher, Jasmine and Amara left the parking lot. But Jasmine's journey wasn't over. After everything she had endured, she chose not to rest but to reach further. She was invited to join the Maryland State Judicial Reform Advisory Council, where she proposed new policies on police training, bias recognition, and citizen ID verification. Because of her relentless efforts, a new law, the Jasmine Fields Justice Act, was passed, requiring all law enforcement in the state to undergo racial equity training and publicly report incidents of discrimination. Jasmine's book, Breaking the Bias, was introduced into several law and sociology curriculums. High school students wrote essays about her. Media campaigns quoted her words like a mantra. "I don't need to be a symbol. But if being handcuffed leads to system change, then no day of my silence was wasted." A special ceremony at Dunbar High School, where Jasmine once studied, was held in her honor. She stood before hundreds of students, parents, and teachers in the same halls where she was once mocked for dreaming of becoming a lawyer. She said, "You may come from anywhere, but don't let the world tell you who you are. Tell the world who you're going to be." The audience rose in applause. Some students wiped tears not from pity, but from deep inspiration. In a year-end NPR interview, the host asked Jasmine, "After all this, do you ever wonder if it was worth it? The pain, the humiliation, being dragged into the street just to fight alone?" Jasmine replied with the calm of someone who had weathered the storm. "I was never alone. Every step I took, I carried millions of unseen footsteps with me. I only spoke up. The echo came from every heart that's ever bowed to injustice." Eventually, Jasmine returned to her modest home in Bolton Hill. Her mother, now frail, always left an empty chair by the window where the two of them would once sit, sip tea, and talk. "You've done things I never dared dream," her mother whispered. "No, Mama," Jasmine said, holding her hand. "You planted the seed. I just kept it alive." One late afternoon, Jasmine took Amara for another walk around the neighborhood. As they passed a large wall in the city center, they saw a freshly completed mural. Jasmine, standing tall, holding the voice recorder, behind her the words, "Justice doesn't always arrive in the light, but when it does, let it be seen clearly." Amara gripped her aunt's hand, her eyes glistening. "Auntie, I want to be someone who doesn't stay quiet too." Jasmine gently squeezed her hand. "Then remember this, baby. Justice doesn't begin in court. It begins in your heart, in choosing not to look away when something's wrong." And they kept walking. A woman who once fell, now standing as a pillar of change. A child, carrying the flame lit by the courage of those who came before. The story ends, but the journey does not. Because everyone who hears this story carries a piece of its responsibility to speak up, to rise, to remind the world of justice. This is not just the story of Jasmine Fields. It's our story, of those who were once dismissed but never allowed their dignity to be buried. And if you're watching this video, like, comment, and subscribe to keep spreading stories that move and inspire. Because you're not just a viewer, you are the continuation. She once stood before the law to defend others. But this time, she became a victim of the very prejudice she had spent her entire career fighting to dismantle. For Jasmine Fields, justice did not come from outrage, it came from resolve. Not everyone is brought down in public view, but when it happens, you have two choices: stay silent and step back, or stand up, tell the truth, and make sure it can never be forgotten. Jasmine chose the second. And because of that, from a painful moment in a parking lot, an entire city was forced to look at itself. She didn't change the world with eloquent words. She did it with unwavering courage and a truth that could not be denied. Because justice should never be a privilege. It must be a fundamental right for every human being. If this story touched your heart, if you believe silence is never the answer, and if you want to see more real, powerful, and inspiring stories like this, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel today. Because maybe the next story will be yours. We don't just tell stories, we ignite change.